The French Revolution is often remembered as the dawn of democracy, a moment when the oppressed rose up against their rulers to demand freedom, equality, and justice. But beneath the ideals of liberty, behind the triumph of the people, lurked a far darker reality, one drenched in blood, madness, and vengeance. This was not merely a political uprising. It was a ritualistic dismantling of an entire way of life, where the monarchy was not just overthrown, it was annihilated, humiliated, and consumed in ways more horrific than history books dare to describe. When King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were led to the guillotine, the executions became more than punishment. They became an act of violent rebirth. Blood was taken as a trophy, bodies were mutilated, and the very graves of past monarchs were torn open, their remains defiled and scattered. Some say the revolutionaries were driven by justice. Others say they were driven by something much darker. The air in Paris was thick with tension on January 21st, 1793. Thousands of people flooded the streets, their breath visible in the cold winter air, all gathered to witness a moment that had never before occurred in French history, the execution of a king. Louis XVI, once the absolute ruler of France, stood at the base of the guillotine. His hands were tied, his hair had been cut short so that the blade could make a clean cut, and his royal robes were replaced by simple clothes, making him indistinguishable from any common prisoner. He was not afraid. Eyewitnesses described him as calm, composed, and almost resigned to his fate. Some accounts say that as he was led up the scaffold, he turned to the crowd and shouted, "I die innocent of all crimes." The revolutionaries did not care. The blade fell. The king's severed head was lifted into the air, and for the first time in history, France had no monarch. The crowd erupted into cheers, but the execution did not end with the king's death. In the moments that followed, the scene took on a disturbing ritualistic nature. As blood pooled on the scaffold, onlookers rushed forward. Many had brought vials, cloths, and even their bare hands. They dipped them into the blood, treating it not as the death of a tyrant, but as a sacred relic. Some believed that having the blood of the king would grant them strength, while others simply wanted to possess a piece of history. Then the most extreme rumors began to spread. Some claimed that members of the crowd had collected pieces of the king's hair, clothing, and even bone fragments after the execution. The most grotesque accounts suggest that there were those who consumed his blood, drinking it in an act of ultimate dominance over the fallen monarchy. While historians debate the truth of these claims, what cannot be denied is the sheer level of ritualistic violence that surrounded the king's death. The execution was not merely justice. It was revenge, raw and primal, carried out by a people who had suffered under his rule for too long. But if Louis XV's execution had been a bloody display, it would pale in comparison to what would happen 9 months later, when the Queen herself was dragged to the guillotine. Marie Antoinette had once been the most powerful woman in France. Now, on the morning of October 16, 1793, she was a prisoner, a widow, and about to die. Her trial had been a mockery of justice, filled with accusations that ranged from political betrayal to incest with her own son. Charges so absurd that even some revolutionaries found them difficult to believe. But the verdict had already been decided before the trial even began. She was guilty, and for that she would die. Unlike her husband, Marie Antoinette did not die with dignity. As she was paraded through the streets, her once lavish hair had been cut unevenly. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and the people screamed insults at her with such fury that her guards struggled to control the crowd. By the time she reached the guillotine, she was shaking, her face pale and drawn. Some say that as she climbed the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and instinctively apologized, her last words before death. Then the blade fell. But what happened next was something far worse than anything Louis XVI had experienced. As the executioner lifted her severed head, women in the crowd surged forward. Unlike the king's death, which had been an act of political defiance, Marie Antoinette's execution had a deeply personal hatred behind it. She had been the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. She had been the queen who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." She had been the untouchable elite who bathed in perfumes while her people starved. Now she was nothing but a corpse. Some women tore strips of her clothing, keeping them as trophies. Others dipped their hands into the blood pooling on the scaffold, smearing it on their faces, their chests, and even their lips. It was an act of symbolic revenge, a declaration that the monarchy's time was over. It is said that some of the women even collected her blood in small bottles, taking it home with them as proof that the Queen was truly dead. This act of blood ritual was not uncommon during the Revolution. The executions were more than just punishment, they were transformations, moments where the revolutionaries sought to erase the old world and create something entirely new. But their hunger for vengeance did not stop with the royal family. Even the dead monarchs of the past would not be safe. In the coming months, revolutionaries would dig up the graves of France's former kings, drag their bones through the streets, and erase centuries of history in an act of brutal defiance. The monarchy was not just overthrown, it was being systematically erased. With the monarchy dismantled and the royal family executed, the revolutionaries turned their wrath towards the past rulers of France. The kings and queens who had once sat on the throne, long dead and buried in sacred tombs, would not be spared from the people's thirst for vengeance. The Basilica of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, had been the burial site of French monarchs for over 1,000 years. Within its crypts lay the remains of kings and queens from Dagobert I in the 7th century to Louis XV in the 18th century. Their bodies, resting in ornate coffins and elaborate tombs, had been untouched for generations. But in 1793 that changed. On the orders of the revolutionary government, a massive desecration of the royal tombs began. The National Convention declared that the Basilica of Saint-Denis was a symbol of tyranny, and the remains of the monarchy had to be destroyed. The revolutionaries entered the basilica, armed with axes, picks, and torches. One by one, the magnificent tombs of the kings and queens of France were smashed open, their sculptures shattered, their inscriptions erased. At first, the revolutionaries dragged the bodies out into the streets, putting them on display for the crowds. Some reports claim that people paraded the skeletons through Paris, holding them up as trophies, proof that the monarchy was truly dead. But then, something even stranger happened. As word spread that royal corpses were being unearthed, a black market for their remains began to emerge. Some people took skulls, bones, and even strips of royal flesh, keeping them as grotesque souvenirs. Others sold these body parts to collectors who saw them as relics of a fallen dynasty. It is rumored that one of Louis XIV's molars was sold as a lucky charm, while a piece of Marie de Medici's skeleton was allegedly turned into a powder and consumed by those who believed it had mystical properties. Some bodies, however, were not kept or sold. They were thrown into mass graves. After the looting of Saint-Denis, dozens of corpses were dumped together in large pits, stripped of their royal status and discarded like common criminals. Today, the royal tombs of France are empty. The remains of centuries of monarchs have been lost to time, their bodies scattered, burned, or stolen. But the revolutionaries were not satisfied with simply destroying the bodies of the past. They wanted to make sure that no symbol of the monarchy remained, and so they continued their ritual of erasure, this time with something even more disturbing. In the months that followed, the revolutionaries began parading the bones of former rulers through the streets, displaying them like grotesque puppets. The revolution had begun as a fight for liberty, but by 1793, it had transformed into something far darker, an obsession with erasing the monarchy from existence. It was no longer enough to execute the royal family. It was no longer enough to destroy their graves and scatter their remains. The revolutionaries wanted to humiliate them beyond death, to ensure their memory carried only shame. The streets of Paris became the stage for a macabre spectacle. The bones of long-dead kings were dragged from the crypts, carried through the streets, and displayed like trophies. Some revolutionaries held skulls high above their heads, chanting slogans of freedom as they mocked the rulers who once claimed divine power. There are accounts of people dancing with skeletons, dressing the bones in rags and pretending to hold mock trials for the deceased monarchs. The revolutionaries believed that by defiling the physical remains of the monarchy, they were symbolically dismantling the monarchy's hold over France forever. One of the most disturbing displays involved Henry VI, one of France's most beloved kings, known for bringing peace after the wars of religion. When his tomb was opened, his corpse was found shockingly intact, his features still recognizable. Rather than show respect, the revolutionaries ripped his body from the coffin, mounted his head on a pike, and carried it through the streets. Onlookers cheered, some claiming that even a good king deserved to be punished for the sins of the monarchy. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had ruled France for over 70 years, suffered a similar fate. His remains were dragged from their resting place, stripped of any valuable artifacts, and thrown into a pit with other royal corpses. The man who had once built the Palace of Versailles, the most extravagant symbol of absolute monarchy, was now nothing more than bones in the dirt. For the revolutionaries, this was more than vengeance. It was psychological warfare. By displaying the skeletons of kings, they wanted to prove to the people that monarchy was dead, that no ruler, living or dead, could ever again control them. But even after this wave of ritualistic destruction, the revolutionaries were not finished with the monarchy. There was still one more target, the woman who had come to symbolize everything wrong with the aristocracy, Marie Antoinette. And as rumors spread that she had been completely oblivious to the suffering of the people, some began to ask an unsettling question. Had she been deliberately kept ignorant? Had she never truly understood what was happening beyond the palace walls? Was it possible that Marie Antoinette had been trapped in a conspiracy, one designed to bring down not just her, but the entire French aristocracy? For centuries, Marie Antoinette has been remembered as the queen who lived in excess while her people starved. The woman who supposedly uttered the infamous words, "Let them eat cake." Though historians widely agree that she never actually said those words, the phrase became a symbol of her detachment from reality, her supposed ignorance of the suffering outside the palace walls. But what if Marie Antoinette had not been simply out of touch? What if she had been deliberately kept in the dark, manipulated by those around her to ensure she remained oblivious? Throughout her time as queen, Marie Antoinette lived in a world of illusions, carefully controlled by her servants, advisors, and courtiers. She was given false reports about the well-being of the people, presented with only carefully curated information, and led to believe that the monarchy was still beloved by the commoners. The people who surrounded her, her butlers, her attendants, even her most trusted confidants, had a vested interest in keeping her blind to the reality outside Versailles. The aristocracy feared losing power, the palace staff feared losing their privileged positions, and those closest to her feared that if she knew the truth, she might act against them. This raises a chilling possibility. Was Marie Antoinette's ignorance manufactured as part of a larger scheme? Was she kept unaware so that, when the revolution came, she would be the perfect scapegoat? Some believe that her isolation and misinformation were not accidental, but intentional. If she could be made into the most hated figure in France, the revolution would have a clear enemy, a figurehead to blame for all of the country's suffering. And that is exactly what happened. The revolutionaries targeted her with relentless propaganda, painting her as the villain behind France's misery. Cartoons and pamphlets depicted her as a heartless seductress, a foreign agent, even a monstrous figure who drained the country's wealth for her own pleasures. Her trial was little more than a spectacle, designed to convince the people that the revolution was justified in its violence. The question remains, if Marie Antoinette had known the full extent of the suffering in France, would she have acted differently? Would she have tried to change the course of history? Or was she doomed from the start, a pawn in a game she never understood? Regardless of the answer, her fate was sealed. She, like her husband, was led to the guillotine, the final victim of a system that had collapsed under its own weight. But her death was not the end of the revolution's bloodshed. In the months and years that followed, France descended into even deeper horrors, where thousands would be slaughtered, drowned, and executed in the name of progress. The monarchy had fallen, but the reign of terror had only just begun. The monarchy was gone. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were dead, their bodies discarded, their dynasty erased. Even the bones of their ancestors had been desecrated, dragged through the streets, and thrown into mass graves. The revolutionaries had not just overthrown a government, They had wiped away centuries of royal history, turning France into something unrecognizable. But even as the old world crumbled, the new one was built on unstable ground. The Republic had been declared, yet France was anything but stable. The streets of Paris, once filled with cries for justice, now echoed with paranoia, betrayal, and the scent of fresh blood. The same people who had cheered for revolution soon found themselves standing on trial, accused of being enemies of the very cause they once fought for. The fall of the monarchy did not bring peace. It opened the floodgates to something far worse. What had started as a fight against tyranny had now become a frenzy of violence that no one could control. The guillotine did not stop with the king and queen. It kept falling. It would claim priests, nobles, commoners, women, and even children. It would claim the very revolutionaries who once wielded its power. And as France spiraled into madness, the blood-soaked streets would soon bear witness to one of the most horrific events of the revolution, the September Massacres. The monarchy had been destroyed, but the revolution was far from over. What came next was something no one had expected, a wave of executions so brutal, so relentless, that even those who once fought for freedom would tremble in fear. In the next chapter of this saga, we will uncover the darkest days of the French Revolution. The streets of Paris would run with more blood. The prisons would become slaughterhouses, and the guillotine, once a tool of justice, would become the executioner of the revolution itself. The revolutionary government, the National Convention, had taken power, but it was weak, fragile, and deeply divided. Meanwhile, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, who had declared their intention to restore the monarchy and crush the revolution. The city of Paris was in a state of panic. As foreign troops advanced toward France's borders, the revolutionaries began to fear that their greatest danger was not outside the country, but within. There were still thousands of people in Parisian prisons, royalist sympathizers, nobles, clergymen, and suspected counter-revolutionaries. The revolutionaries believed that if Prussia and Austria invaded, these prisoners would rise up, join the enemy, and slaughter the people of Paris from within. The paranoia reached its peak when news arrived that the fortress of Verdun had fallen to the Prussians. This meant that enemy troops were marching toward Paris, and at any moment, the capital could be invaded. With fear and rage gripping the city, the people of Paris came to one terrifying conclusion. They could not risk leaving prisoners alive. The revolutionaries did not wait for a trial. They did not wait for orders. They took justice into their own hands. And over the next 5 days, they would turn Paris into a slaughterhouse. On September 2nd, 1792, a mob of revolutionaries stormed the prisons of Paris. What began as an act of defense against imaginary traitors quickly descended into a mass execution. The first to die were the priests. In the Abbaye prison, more than 200 priests were dragged from their cells and into the courtyard. The revolutionaries claimed they were conspirators, plotting to overthrow the Republic. One by one, they were lined up and slaughtered. Some were hacked apart with swords, others were bludgeoned to death with clubs. Those who tried to plead for mercy were met with laughter and jeers. The massacre spread like wildfire. In the La Force prison, women and children were among the victims. The Princesse de Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was dragged before a crowd of revolutionaries. She was given a choice: swear loyalty to the revolution or die. She refused. What happened next was one of the most infamous acts of violence of the entire revolution. She was beaten, stripped naked, and hacked apart with swords. Her severed head was mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets. Some accounts claim that her heart was cut out and eaten by one of the revolutionaries, though this remains disputed. The killing continued for 5 days. In the Conciergerie prison, nobles and royalists were thrown into the streets, where waiting crowds tore them apart with their bare hands. Some were tied together and executed en masse. By the time the bloodshed ended, nearly 1,400 people had been slaughtered. The prisons, once filled with prisoners, now reeked of death. The streets ran red with blood, and the revolution had crossed a terrifying threshold. The people of Paris had become executioners, but they were not yet satisfied. The guillotine had been built to replace the barbaric, chaotic executions of the past. It was supposed to be swift, efficient, and humane, But now, the guillotine became something else entirely. It became entertainment. The September massacres shocked even some of the revolution's most radical leaders, but to the people of Paris, this was justice. How did ordinary men and women, many of whom had once been farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, become executioners overnight? Part of the answer lies in the power of the mob. When a person stands alone, they hesitate, but when surrounded by hundreds of screaming revolutionaries, that hesitation disappears. The frenzy of the crowd takes over, and individuals become consumed by the collective will. Propaganda also played a role. Revolutionary newspapers spread wild rumors about imprisoned nobles planning massacres against the people. These stories fueled the paranoia, making violence seem like a necessary act of self-defense. Finally, there was the thrill of power. The people of France had lived under the rule of kings for centuries. They had spent their lives as subjects, following orders, bowing before their rulers. Now, for the first time, they were the ones in control. The executions were not just punishment, they were an assertion of dominance. The revolutionaries believed they were not just killing individuals, but killing an entire system of oppression. And soon, the guillotine would make that process even easier. Paris had been drenched in blood by angry mobs, but now, the revolution would become more organized, more efficient, and even more terrifying. The guillotine would become a machine of mass death, and the people of Paris would gather to watch, to cheer, and to turn public executions into a national obsession. The September massacres had proven one thing: Paris had an insatiable thirst for blood. Fear had turned to paranoia. Paranoia had turned to murder. And now, murder had turned into entertainment. The guillotine, once introduced as a humane alternative to brutal executions, now became the centerpiece of a national spectacle. Crowds no longer watched in horror. They cheered, they laughed, they celebrated. The execution site in the Place de la Révolution became theatre, and the daily beheadings were treated as performances. Some Parisians arrived early to claim the best spots, much like they would at the opera. They brought food and drink, turning the executions into picnics, where they could eat fresh bread and sip wine while heads rolled before them. The women of Paris, known as the tricoteuses, sat at the front, knitting as they watched the condemned die. Their needles clicked methodically, matching the rhythm of the falling blade. Some whispered among themselves, placing bets on how long a victim would struggle before their body stopped twitching. Children were brought to the scaffold to witness the executions as a lesson in justice. Some revolutionaries believed that watching the death of traitors would harden the next generation, a new France built on the corpses of the old regime. The executioners became celebrities. The most famous among them was Charles-Henri Sanson, the royal executioner turned servant of the revolution. He had once executed criminals in secret, but now his work was on display for all of Paris to see. His precision with the guillotine was admired, and he became a household name. Some even requested to shake his hand, believing it gave them good luck. But no execution drew more crowds than the deaths of former nobles, priests, and revolutionaries turned traitors. The people gathered in the thousands to see the famous fall under the blade. And one of the most shocking executions was yet to come. The revolution claimed many lives, but it would soon turn against one of its own, a woman who had fought for justice but dared to fight for women's rights. Her name was Olympe de Gouges, and for her, the guillotine was waiting. Olympe de Gouges had once believed in the revolution. She had written plays, pamphlets, and essays in support of liberty, fighting against the oppression of the monarchy. But unlike many revolutionaries, she did not believe that freedom should be reserved for men. She argued that women deserved the same rights as men. She wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a direct response to the revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man. In it, she boldly stated, "Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights." She called for women to have a voice in politics, the right to vote, and the right to divorce abusive husbands. She also opposed the execution of Louis XVI, believing that a just society should not be built on vengeance. But the revolution did not want her ideas. The leaders of the National Convention saw her feminism as dangerous, and her opposition to violence as a betrayal. In 1793, She was arrested and charged with sedition. Her trial was a farce. She was denied legal representation, mocked in court, and sentenced to death. The revolution, which had once fought against the silencing of voices, now silenced one of its own. On November 3rd, 1793, Olympe de Gouges was led to the guillotine. As she climbed the scaffold, she turned to the crowd and shouted her final words, "Children of the fatherland, you will avenge my death." The blade fell, her head was lifted into the air, and the revolution had executed one of its most brilliant minds, one of the few who had dared to fight for justice without bloodshed. But even as the guillotine continued to claim victims, the revolution was already beginning to crumble. Its leaders were turning against each other. The executions were no longer enough. The people were hungry for more. And soon, France would see even greater horrors, drownings, mass executions, and even rumors of cannibalism. The revolution had lost its way, and the bloodbath was far from over. The streets of Paris were drenched in red. The September massacres had proven that the people were willing to kill without hesitation. The guillotine had transformed from a tool of justice into a machine of mass murder. And yet, the revolutionaries had not stopped. Anyone suspected of betraying the revolution was executed without trial. Nobles, priests, former revolutionaries, women, and even children were led to the scaffold. By the end of 1793, nearly 17,000 people had been executed. The blood had once been reserved for kings and queens. Now it belonged to everyone. The reign of terror had begun, and no one would be spared. What had started as a fight for justice had become an endless cycle of death. The revolutionaries had killed the king, the queen, the nobles, and the priests. But soon, they would kill their own leaders, their own friends, and even their own children. Paris had become a city of starvation. The revolution had destroyed the monarchy, the nobility, and the old social order, but it had also destroyed France's economy. Food was running out, bread was scarce, meat was expensive, and for many, starvation was just as terrifying as the guillotine. And then, the whispers began. In the poorer districts of Paris, rumors spread that certain butchers never ran out of meat. Even when food shortages were at their worst, even when other markets had nothing left to sell, these shops always had fresh cuts. At first, people didn't ask questions. They were too hungry to care. But then, someone did. According to accounts that surfaced years later, a customer at a Parisian butcher shop became suspicious when she noticed that the cuts of meat looked unusual, too pale, too soft, too similar to something disturbingly familiar. Then came the most terrifying claim of all. Some of the butchered flesh still had tattooed skin attached to it. The whispers turned into full-blown panic. The revolution had killed so many people that the mass graves were overflowing. The guillotine never stopped, and if some desperate, depraved individuals had found a way to profit off the corpses, what was stopping them? There was never any official investigation, no trials, no arrests. But the rumors alone were enough to send waves of fear through Paris. Were the people of France, who had fought to destroy the monarchy, now consuming their own dead? Or was it just another symptom of a city driven mad by hunger, terror, and the ever-present stench of death? Either way, the fear of cannibalism was nothing compared to what happened next. Because soon, the revolutionaries discovered a far more efficient way to kill, a way to execute thousands at once, a way to erase people from existence without a single drop of blood left behind. The guillotine had been effective, but slow. The prisons were overflowing with enemies of the revolution. The government needed a new way to purge the traitors. And so, in the city of Nantes, a man named Jean-Baptiste Carrier devised a new method of execution. He called it the National Baths. It was simple. Thousands of prisoners, men, women, and children were dragged from their cells, stripped naked, and tied together in large groups. Then, they were herded onto barges and taken out onto the dark waters of the Loire River. And once they were far enough from shore, the executioners sank the boats. The prisoners, still bound together, were left to drown, screaming, thrashing against the water, pulling each other down into the depths. Some tried to break free. Others pleaded for their lives. It didn't matter. None of them survived. Over the course of 4 months, more than 4,000 people were drowned in the Loire River. Some were pregnant women, some were elderly nobles who could barely walk, some were teenagers, guilty of nothing except being related to an aristocrat. And when the bodies washed up on the riverbanks, bloated and rotting, the revolutionaries simply shoved them back into the water. The national baths became a horror, even other revolutionaries found difficult to justify. Carrier himself bragged about his mass executions, calling them a necessary cleansing of France. But even this was not enough to satisfy the revolution. The killings had no rules, no limits. Not even children and the elderly were spared. The revolution had once claimed to fight for the people, but by 1794, even the most helpless members of society were being slaughtered. Elderly aristocrats were dragged from their homes, thrown into carts, and taken to the guillotine. Some could barely stand, their frail bodies too weak to fight back. Teenagers, even children as young as 14, were accused of treason and sentenced to death. One of the most infamous cases was the execution of the Dauphin's governess, Madame de Tourzel. She was an old woman, frail, loyal to the monarchy, but harmless. None of that mattered. She was paraded through the streets, mocked, beaten, and finally beheaded before a cheering crowd. And she was not the only one. Any child who had noble blood was seen as a threat to the revolution's future. Some were executed by guillotine, others were drowned in the Loire River. By this point, there were no rules, there was only blood, and in the depths of the revolution's hidden prisons, even darker horrors were taking place. The guillotine had turned the streets of Paris into a theatre of death, but inside the prisons of the revolution, an entirely different kind of horror was taking place. Not everyone accused of treason was executed immediately. Some were thrown into secret prisons, left to rot in filthy cells, subjected to bizarre experiments, and driven to the brink of madness. These prisons became laboratories of cruelty, where the revolutionaries tested just how much suffering a human being could endure before breaking completely. And the worst part? No one outside the prison walls could hear the screams. The hell of La Force prison, the city of the damned. One of the most notorious prisons was La Force, originally built as a debtor's prison, but converted by the revolution into a holding pen for enemies of the state. It became so overcrowded that prisoners were forced to sleep in piles, their bodies pressed against the filth-covered stone. Diseases rampaged through the cells. The air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh, human waste, and decay. But the true terror of La Force was not just the conditions, it was the psychological torture. The guards made a game of tormenting the prisoners, whispering false rumors, toying with their emotions, and playing cruel tricks on their already fragile minds. One of their favorite tortures was to randomly enter a cell and announce that someone had been pardoned. A prisoner, delirious with hope, would be led out, believing they had been granted freedom, only to be taken directly to the guillotine. Those left behind would hear the faint sound of the blade falling, followed by the cheers of the crowd outside. The hope of survival was torture in itself. And then there were the experiments. While La Force was known for its psychological cruelty, Desecrating prison became infamous for something far worse. The guards here were not content to simply watch prisoners suffer. They wanted to study their pain. There were reports, some official, others whispered in fear, that prisoners were subjected to medical experiments. Some were starved for weeks, just to see how long a man could survive before madness set in. Others were infected with diseases to test how the body deteriorated under extreme stress. Some were even subjected to mock executions, forced to stand before a guillotine, while the blade was deliberately stopped inches above their necks, then thrown back into their cells, left to wonder if the next time would be real. One of the most chilling reports from Desecrating prison was the use of the cage of silence. A prisoner would be locked inside a pitch-black, soundproof chamber, completely cut off from any human interaction. No light, no voices, no sense of time. Prisoners left in the cage of silence for too long often emerged completely broken, either reduced to catatonic states or raving with insanity. One survivor, after being released from Desecrating, was later found wandering the streets of Paris, mumbling the names of the people he had seen executed, convinced that he was already dead. But even these horrors were nothing compared to what was happening in the conciergerie. the final stop before the guillotine. If someone was sent to the conciergerie, they were already dead. The prison was known as the waiting room of death, where prisoners spent their final days before execution. It was designed not just to imprison people, but to break them completely before they died. Prisoners were forced to watch their fellow inmates dragged to the guillotine, knowing their turn was next. Each night, the guards would walk down the halls marking the names of those who would die the next day. Some prisoners tried to bribe the guards to remove their names. Others collapsed into despair. But the most terrifying thing about the conciergerie was the silence. Unlike the streets outside, where crowds screamed and celebrated the executions, inside the prison, the condemned rarely spoke. Survivors described the eerie quiet, as if everyone had already accepted their death long before the blade fell. One prisoner wrote, "Each night I closed my eyes knowing that I might never open them again. The only thing more unbearable than the fear was the waiting." But the most ironic and poetic fate of all was still to come, because soon, the man who had built the Reign of Terror, the man who had sent thousands to the guillotine, would find himself locked in the same cell, walking the same path, awaiting the same fate. Robespierre, the architect of the revolution, was about to be consumed by his own creation. For years, Maximilien Robespierre had ruled the revolution with an iron grip. He had been the architect of the Reign of Terror, the mastermind behind the mass executions, and the man who had decided who lived and who died. Under his rule, France had become a nation of fear. He had executed nobles, priests, commoners, women, children, and even his fellow revolutionaries. But paranoia is a disease, and once it infects a man, it never lets go. Robespierre saw enemies everywhere. He began to eliminate his own allies, convinced that even those closest to him were plotting against him. And when a man turns against his own, it is only a matter of time before they turn against him. By mid-1794, Robespierre had pushed France to its breaking point. The Reign of Terror had already killed tens of thousands of people, but he demanded more blood. He declared that the revolution was still under threat and that new traitors had to be found. But this time, he refused to name them. He stood before the National Convention, the revolutionary government, and announced that he had a list of conspirators, a list of men who plotted against the revolution. But he did not say who they were. Panic rippled through the assembly. Every man in the room felt his stomach drop. Every man wondered, am I on that list? For the first time, the revolutionaries felt the fear they had inflicted on so many others, and they realized something terrifying. If Robespierre was not stopped, he would kill them all. The very next day, July 27, 1794, the National Convention struck first. Robespierre arrived at the assembly, expecting to be greeted as the savior of the revolution. Instead, he was interrupted. A member of the assembly stood up and shouted, "Down with the tyrant!" The room erupted into chaos. The men who had once followed Robespierre without question now stood against him. One after another, they turned on him, shouting for his arrest. Robespierre tried to speak to defend himself, but each time he opened his mouth, his voice failed him. He had spent years delivering fiery speeches, sending thousands to their deaths. And now, at the moment of his greatest need, his voice betrayed him. The assembly voted to arrest him. The Reign of Terror was over, and now Robespierre would face the same fate as his victims. But Robespierre was not finished yet. That night, his supporters broke him out of prison and took him to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. There, he and his last remaining allies planned a final resistance, but no one came to help them. The people of Paris, who had once cheered his rise, now stood silent. They had seen enough blood. At 2 a.m., soldiers stormed the building. A gunshot rang out. Robespierre had been shot in the face. Some say he tried to kill himself, choosing to die on his own terms rather than be executed. Others say he was shot by one of the soldiers. Either way, his jaw was shattered. As he lay on the ground, bleeding and barely conscious, the soldiers dragged him away. The man who had once sent thousands to the guillotine was now being taken to his own execution. On July 28, 1794, the streets of Paris were packed with people. They had come to see the man who had ruled them with terror finally meet his end. Robespierre was led to the guillotine, his face swollen, his jaw hanging loose, wrapped in a filthy bandage. He could not speak, he could not plead for mercy. He could only watch as the executioner prepared the blade. And then, the man who had built the reign of terror felt the terror himself. The executioner tore the bandage from his face, exposing his shattered jaw. Robespierre let out a scream of agony. The crowd erupted in laughter. The people who had once obeyed his every word now mocked his suffering. He was placed on the scaffold, the blade was raised, and then it fell. His severed head was lifted into the air, just as he had ordered for so many others. The crowd cheered. The reign of terror was finally over, but France was broken beyond repair. With Robespierre dead, the execution slowed. The guillotine, once used every single day, now stood silent. The prisons, once overflowing with condemned souls, now emptied. The reign of terror had killed nearly 50,000 people. And for what? The revolution had promised a new world, one of liberty, equality, and justice. Instead, it had become a nightmare. The monarchy was gone, the revolutionaries were gone, and all that remained was the blood in the streets. The reign of terror had ended. The guillotine had fallen silent. The prisons had emptied. The fear that had ruled Paris for years was finally lifting. But for the people of France, the nightmare was far from over. The revolution had promised a better world, a nation built on freedom, equality, and justice. Instead, it had left behind a country in ruins. The economy was collapsing. Entire families had been wiped out. Cities were haunted by the ghosts of the dead. For those who had survived, life would never be the same. The terror had left deep scars, not just on the streets of Paris, but inside the minds of its people. For years, men and women had been forced to watch their loved ones dragged away, to hear their names read out as the next to die, to witness their executions in public squares. Some had betrayed their own families, turning in brothers, sisters, parents, and friends to save themselves. Now, they had to live with that guilt. There were stories of mothers who had screamed their children's names in their sleep, haunted by the sound of the guillotine, fathers who had once believed in the revolution, only to lose everything to it, and children who had grown up watching heads fall into baskets, their innocence stolen by the very movement that had sworn to create a better future. Even those who had once cheered for the executions now looked back in horror at what they had become. Had they really enjoyed the bloodshed? Had they really laughed as the guillotine took another life? Had they truly become monsters? The revolution had been meant to save France. Instead, it had broken it beyond repair. With Robespierre dead, the government struggled to rebuild itself. The National Convention, desperate to distance itself from the reign of terror, passed laws to end the mass executions. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The revolution had lost its original purpose. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been drowned in blood. And just a few years later, France would fall into the hands of another ruler, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would crown himself emperor, replacing the monarchy that the revolutionaries had fought so hard to destroy. The great experiment in democracy had failed, and the people of France had paid the price. Even after the reign of terror ended, the guillotine remained. For decades, it continued to be France's official method of execution. The machine that had killed kings, queens, revolutionaries, and commoners alike continued to take lives well into the 20th century. It was not until 1977, nearly 200 years after the revolution, that the guillotine was finally abandoned. By then, the blood of the past had already seeped too deep into the soil of France. And though the executions had stopped, the terror had never truly disappeared. Even today, the echoes of that time still haunt the streets of Paris. The revolution had promised a new world. Instead, it had given France a history written in blood. The French Revolution began with a dream. It was supposed to free the people from oppression, to bring down a corrupt monarchy, to give power back to the citizens. But instead, it had become a war against itself. It had promised justice, but delivered fear. It had promised liberty, but enforced control. It had promised equality, but created mass executions. And in the end, no one was spared. The revolution had killed the king. It had killed the queen. It had killed the nobles. It had killed the revolutionaries themselves. It had devoured its own creators, leaving nothing behind but death, destruction, and regret. And though the reign of terror ended in 1794, its horrors were never forgotten. Even today, the French Revolution remains one of the bloodiest uprisings in human history, a time when justice turned to vengeance, when freedom became slavery, when brothers became executioners, and when the people of France became prisoners of their own revolution. This was the true cost of the French Revolution, a cost measured in blood,